Hey, what is up YouTube? This is Piles here with another one of my videos, and today, once again, we are back in tier list territory as we are going to look at the Elder Scrolls series. This is a series and a franchise that really needs no introduction. Everyone is very familiar with the games that are on offer. Everyone at least has that one game, at least that I've talked to, has had that one game, that one Elder Scrolls game that's really near and dear to their heart. It's been around for decades at this point. We're still waiting for the sequel for Elder Scrolls 6 to come out. At this rate, probably 2034. You can put money on that, but that's what I'm predicting at the moment. So here are the games. There are two games that I haven't played in the series. I haven't played I haven't played Elder Scrolls Blades, which I haven't heard great things about, and plus I believe it's only a Wii exclusive or a Switch exclusive, so that is not really too concerning. And then the Elder Scrolls Online as well, which I've heard mixed things about. I just haven't set it up. I'm not really into MMOs, but I've heard mixed things about the game. Some people at launch, I remember this game was not really very well liked, but a lot of people have said it's much improved and it's come a long way. So if that's the case, you know, all the power to you if you enjoy it. It's not something that I've played or really have had the time for, but I've made the time for all the other mainline games, so we'll get to that. I'm also just going to shuffle the order a little bit, as you see right there. But the first one we're going to start with is Elder Scrolls Arena, which is the first Elder Scrolls game that was made and developed by Bethesda at the time, Bethesda Softworks. And overall, I mean, the game is incredibly ambitious when you look at what it was able to do. You know, give you a huge open world, tons of side quests, and to have this all on MS-DOS is quite a freaking achievement when you think about it. I mean, it's really is remarkable what they were able to do with the time and just how ambitious it was and everything. So I think there's a lot of significance there, and also too being the first one. However, when you actually sit down to play it, you start realizing a lot of the game's faults. One of the first few games of the Elder Scrolls series used the whole mouse-based combat with movement, and it was never really something that players liked, which is why hence they went more to, or I shouldn't say they didn't like, but it was always like a mixed result kind of thing. Like you would just swing constantly, and you know, you would just pray that you would hit. Yeah, if you swung a certain way, you can do more damage. Like as a stab would probably be more effective with a spear than a slash would, etc., etc. But when it comes to outside of the mouse-based combat and the whole dice rolls and everything, the problem with Arena is that I have personally is just the pacing of it. Just trying to get out of that first dungeon really takes a long time, way longer than it needs to. And this was well improved in the sequel Daggerfall. And that's kind of the best way I can summarize this game without going too deep. Elder Scrolls Arena, to me, is basically a worse version of Daggerfall. You can call it Daggerfall Light or Daggerfall Alpha, because that's how I interpret it as. It just doesn't really go into it. It's like there's not really too much of a reason to go play it, because everything that was in the game was basically expanded in the second one, and the second one has had much more support from the community in terms of mods and all that stuff. So we'll get into that very shortly, but at the time I will need to place this game, and I didn't really think about this one too much, but I don't want to put it on D because there's a couple games that I want to throw on there. We'll put this at C. I think that's a good place for it. You know, it's not the worst of the series, and trust me, we'll get there. There's some real stinkers in the series, unfortunately. But honestly, when it comes to Arena, it's just you could still have fun with it, and I think if you grew up with it, you may still enjoy it. But to me personally, I just think it's a worse Daggerfall, and I can put it at C. Which brings us to the next game that I keep talking about, and that is Daggerfall. And honestly, I have a very soft spot for this game. It was also for MS-DOS as well, but when you play it, it just feels so much more advanced. One of the things that I didn't mention in, well, actually no, in Arena you could rest, never mind. But one of the besides the combat feeling a little better, even though it's still, dice rolls. One of the things is that you can change the adjust the speed of the game, which also will adjust experience gain and whatnot. You also have a far more in-depth tutorial. I mean, it's just messages, but it's way better. You can get out of that first dungeon way quicker, and honestly, I've just had a ton of fun with Daggerfall and just getting lost in the dungeons and whatnot. Uh, Arena and Daggerfall do suffer from very similar problems. One of the biggest issues with both games is, running on MS-DOS definitely shows its age when it comes to a lot of the UI, usability, etc., etc. For Daggerfall, I found it to be way easier to manage the UI compared to the first game, even though it can get a little messy sometimes. And remembering, okay, press this button, open up this menu, but it's really not as hard. Also, too, you can enable mouse look. So there's a couple things that you can do to enhance your experience. And this is before I even get into the whole Unity engine thing, which I won't. There's a huge mod for this game. Basically, puts this game into the Unity engine, and it's a great mod. It's honestly fantastic, and I would recommend it, but I will not let it determine the tier ranking for that, because that kind of, when you play it, it's kind of a separate thing entirely, and I don't think it really should be on this game, because at that point you could just throw all of them on S tier, really, because they all have a great modding community. So it kind of doesn't matter too much. But anyways, if it was a separate entry, I'd put it up pretty high. But yeah, some of the things too is the draw distance. Basically, you're going to be fast traveling everywhere you go. Fast traveling to the dungeons, fast traveling to the towns to resupply, to buy some weapons, upgrade, get some quests, and then go back to the dungeons. So the loop is pretty repetitive compared to other Elder Scrolls games. I mean, a lot of Elder Scrolls games, you do have to go to dungeons and explore, but for Daggerfall, it can feel very repetitive because most of your time will be spent in dungeons, because the way the dungeons are laid out are incredibly confusing. Some of the issues I have with the later dungeons is that they're just one singular line, but then when you go back and play this game, it's like, okay, I can kind of see why. It's just a little ridiculous to expect, to have to go through all these dungeons and to try to find your way out. And a lot of them are bugged too, like the quest locations are bugged. So you may not even be able to solve them without actually breaking the game, which is pretty ridiculous, They all, I mean, Bethesda's always had buggy games, so that's kind of a part of the territory. But like I said, I have a soft spot for this game, and the Unity mod for this game, the Unity engine mod for this game, is fan-freaking-tastic. I know I talk a lot I talk a lot of bad stuff about the Unity engine, but I mean, that beats any old, rickety engine from the MS-DOS days. So honestly, I would recommend that. But for Daggerfall itself, I will put this at B tier. It is better than Arena. It's obviously not the best in the series like that. I think a lot of people can agree with me on that. So I will put it at B tier, and I think that's a good spot for it to lie. Next up is Battlespire, and this one is a spin-off to the main series. So you had Elder Scrolls 1, Elder Scrolls 2, Morrowind was in development. Funny enough, in this game, if you open up the box, it does say Morrowind. I think it was like 1998 or 1999 release planned, and didn't come until way, years after that, well into the 2000s. So kind of funny to look back in hindsight, like what happens if, Morrowind was even released in the 90s. But that's kind of a side issue. For Battlespire itself, it is a departure in the sense of you have, instead of it being a, okay, go wherever you want, very open world kind of game, it ends up being a linear dungeon crawler, basically. Not in the terms of the really old school ones where it's like grid based, it's all real time, but it's very linear in its movement. Now, theoretically, the game has a lot going for it. I mean, graphically, it looks better, like from the environments and stuff. They actually look really good. Some of the enemies, the models, or the sprites that they use, the sprite work is pretty good. It also has a really unique mechanic, which I wish was explored in other Elder Scrolls games, where you can actually talk to the enemies and try to befriend them, or try to even do quests for them, or something. Like, you can discover things and learn a little bit more about the world and where the hell you are. So I really love that feature in this game. Unfortunately, everything else kind of sucks. The mouse-based combat returns, and once again, it's all dice rolls, so just keep swinging and hoping you hit. The game is incredibly buggy. Anything can kill you. You can fall through the scenery randomly, or if you get too close to the edge. The game just has a lot of technical issues, and it just looks like it was not finished. One of the things with the AI is that it'll run to you and then it'll just bug out and just not attack you at all. There's so many like little things like this, and it really hampers the overall experience, and it's such a shame, because I think conceptually the game could have been awesome, and it does have some fun things. Like I mentioned, the talking to the enemies and trying to convince that you're on their side, because a lot of these characters, these enemies, they appear in future Elder Scrolls games, but there's no way to interact with them. They're just, hostile all the time. So it's really a shame that this game is as bad as it is. And like I said, most of it is just technical issues. Really just an unbalanced game. Like, you playing this game, you can set up your class, whatever. And one of the things is, if you pick wrong, you're going to have a terrible time. However, if you pick right, it's going to be very easy, because the game is going to be completely unbalanced. Like, it'll be completely to your favor. So there's only like some builds that you can use that really make sense for the experience. So it's just a shame that it just feels very unfinished, because it looks amazing, like compared to the other two games. So it looks amazing. But like I said, it ultimately wasn't a very good game, and that's why it doesn't really get talked about. I didn't even know this game existed, and I didn't even know Redguard existed until years later, but we'll get into Redguard very shortly. But for Battlespire, I'm gonna have to throw it on a D, and I hate to do that, because I really do think that the potential is there. But I'm looking at Arena and I'm looking at Daggerfall, and I'm like, I don't know if I'd put it at the same tier as Arena. Definitely not Daggerfall, no way. Next up is Redguard, and I was very sympathetic when it comes to Battlespire, because I overall think it feels like an Elder Scrolls game. I can't say the same for Redguard. Redguard, to me personally, it feels like a completely different game that's outside of the Elder Scrolls license. Like, I haven't looked too much into the development of this game, but it does feel like this was supposed to be another game entirely, but they just kind of like put Elder Scrolls characters within it, and they were like, oh, we only got like 2 days and then we got to ship this. So then it was just a rush. That's how it feels. I'm not saying that's what it is, but it just feels like this game just had no time. And it really was just trying to cash in on the Tomb Raider craze. So instead of it being a traditional RPG like the other three, where, okay, you create your character, pick your class, etc., your skills, this one opts for a action adventure very similar in the vein of Tomb Raider. However, it plays worse than Tomb Raider. It looks way worse. The controls are garbage. Like, if you play this game, like, as soon as you start, it's like garbage. You start at this ship battle, like, once you take control, you get some pretty cool cutscenes, okay, for the time. The music is fantastic, though. I will say, Redguard has some fan-freaking-tastic music. The opening music is great, but everything else is just terrible. It honestly looks like, even though this is a PC game, it looks worse than Tomb Raider did, and which I'm pretty sure Tomb Raider came out before this, because it's copying almost verbatim. And it looks worse than like a PS1 game. It looks terrible. The animations are clunky. It just looks unfinished. Like, again, it's even more unfinished than Battlespire, and it really just goes to show you where the state of Bethesda was before Morrowind. Because if Morrowind failed, I can't even fathom Bethesda would have continued on. They probably would have petered out, or I assume get bought up by another company, and then, their legacy will be forever altered. Now they're bought out, but it would have been closer. It would have been sooner rather than later. But yeah, I don't really like this game at all. The controls are terrible. Like I said, it tries to play like a Tomb Raider and looks worse than it. The story is okay, but the voice acting is just terrible. The world building is alright. I mean, all Elder Scrolls games have very solid world building, but that should not be mistaken for a good narrative. Overall, I think this game is terrible. I don't like talking about it. I just don't like this game at all. I'm really not enjoying mentioning it. So screw this game and yeah, stay away from it. All right, now we're in the holy trinity of Elder Scrolls games. I mean, this is once you get to Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim, that's really when you start to get into that level of nostalgia that a lot of people have and where you get to that level of fondness. Because personally, I never heard of Elder Scrolls, and pretty sure I was around during this time, but I've never heard of Elder Scrolls really until Morrowind. And once Morrowind came out, it was like a huge deal. Like, I remember a lot of people talking about it. You know, it was huge, great for the time. The world was huge for the time. It's small now compared to the future games and even Daggerfall prior. But it was just so impressive. The music is great. The graphics, fidelity-wise, not very high compared to, you know, later games, obviously. But the art style, like everything just looks absolutely gorgeous. You know, when people talk about Morrowind, everyone will tell you it's just an absolutely beautiful game. And I will say that, you know, I do definitely share the sentiment in many ways than one. However, there are some as beloved as Morrowind is, there are some issues that I do have with the game. Unfortunately, it maintains that mouse combat, which I've never just been that, you know, I was never that much of a fan of. But in Morrowind, it feels worse somehow than the previous games prior. I think it's because it's just fully 3D, so, you know, seeing your weapons go through or just kind of go into the ether, it really takes you out of the experience. I know there's mods, and I don't want to hear the mod debate for any of these because, like I said, that would put everything on S tier, so no. Unless outside of Battlespire and Redguard, because they probably don't have mods. But anyways, so you have a lot of the similar freedoms of prior games, with a lot more added into it. I never mentioned the spell system, but the spell system in this game is fan-freaking-tastic. You know, being able to fly and etc. etc. Funny enough, though, there's no fast travel in this game, which I always found a bit weird. But at the same time, the world is very small, and you do have caravans, so it's not that crazy to, you know, maneuver around. But I would say that, oh, and plus too, the UI can be a little clunky at times. So as much as I do enjoy this game still, and as much as I can still recommend this game, I don't necessarily know if I want to go all the way and put this on the S tier. And I know some people are going to go crazy here, but the reason why is just because it does feel clunky to go back into, and getting back into it, it's like I have to kind of get back into the mood, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like I can't just pick up and play compared to the later titles, and that may be a good or bad thing depending on what you're looking for. But it's definitely showed its age, especially, you know, with the combat and just the overall clunkiness of some of the things. So I'm probably gonna go to Oblivion for this, but I'm gonna just put this at A. I know this is probably sacrilege and people are going to get to me, but listen, I'm not trying to blind myself with nostalgia or anything, because I can definitely see people put it to S, but trust me when I say I know some people that they've played this a lot as a kid and they can't even touch it anymore. So, like, I'm being generous. Like, there's some issues that have not, you know, aged very well. And like I said, combat being one of them, and some of the other things. But I'd still say it's a great Elder Scrolls game, and it's a great experience throughout. All right, next up is Oblivion, and to me, I feel like this is one of the most memed games of all time. Same with Skyrim, you can say, but I feel like Oblivion is memed more in the negative sense. Skyrim is memed more in like, oh, the mods or the silly stuff, or, you know, here's some glitches. But the Oblivion is just like how bad the character models are and just how ugly, you know, the whole game is. And I do kind of have to agree with some of it. I mean, Morrowind had such a very unique spore-like setting, you know, with these mushrooms, that honestly, Morrowind just felt kind of a little bit like almost like a medieval alien planet. I don't think there's going to be a setting as unique as Morrowind, at least nothing that comes to mind at the moment. But Oblivion goes back more for the European fantasy route, which is fine. I would say Arena and Daggerfall are like metal fantasy, like yeah, like or D&D fantasy. I don't really know. Let's call it metal fantasy, or hair metal fantasy. Yeah, but Oblivion itself is more of just traditional European fantasy, which is fine. Like I said, medieval European fantasy, which is fine. Um, I do agree with a lot of people though that the game does look kind of muddy, at least for the character models. The environments are okay, but the game suffers from a ton of bloom visually, just a lot of bloom everywhere. That was kind of the standard of the time for some reason. But overall, I mean, I kind of at the time I had some issues with it. I just felt like it wasn't that good, especially because I was put off by a lot of that stuff, and it has some very poor level scaling. But over the years, I've kind of liked it more. Like, after revisiting it after a few years, I kind of like it a lot more now than I did back in the day, which is funny because I would say, prior Morrowind was clear superior to Oblivion. But now I kind of don't feel that way. I feel like Oblivion, to me now is kind of fun. I guess I can't really put it into words, but it's just much more enjoyable now. It still has some issues with the scaling and whatnot, but looking back at it, and playing it, it's just like, you step away from that dice roll thing and go more into the action oriented affair. Now, I will say that Elder Scrolls Combat, even action wise, is still not very great compared to other RPGs of now and later. I mean, there's just games that's come out that the combat is far superior and, before and after. So won't get too deep into that. But still, going from a dice base to an action base was far more satisfying to me. Spells didn't just like fail all the time, so that was another thing. Morrowind, like you had to build, and games prior, like you had to build a spell character or you were screwed, which was, it's kind of an issue in this game too, like building your character right. The other prior games had a really bad issue with that. This one still kind of does, but not to that level. I think Skyrim overcorrects itself, but we'll get into that in a bit. So yeah, I would say overall, I mean, Oblivion is much better now than it was back in the day, which is so odd. I don't know if I'd say outright, oh, it's better than Morrowind, because I do think Morrowind is better in world building and, the environment and just finding the secrets. Oblivion has terrible level scaling, as I said. I think I'm probably going to put this in the A. And I know that's like, or maybe like an A minus. I can create keep it here. We'll keep it A. All right. Next, we have Skyrim, which Skyrim has been alive and kicking for a long time now. It's funny. I remember this game was at the time of launch and even a couple years after. You couldn't go 5 seconds without hearing anyone talking about this game. And it was all positive. I don't think I heard any negative, not a single negative comment when this game was around. Now I think the narrative is switched a little bit. Not that people hate Skyrim now. I would never go that far. But I think it's like we're getting tired of it now because it's been so long and people are waiting for the next game. We're waiting for Elder Scrolls 6, and a lot of Skyrim's issues are starting to show. So I think it's kind of, and the fact that it's still being heavily pushed, the whole modding issue with like paid mods and Creation Club and all that stuff. So there's a lot tainting it now that it wasn't 10 years prior. That's an unfortunate side effect of some of the business practices of Bethesda and whatever. Kind of why they are in the situation they are now, but that's a side issue. But with Skyrim, at the time, it's kind of similar to Oblivion, where it's like at the time, I had some issues with some of the removal of and the oversimplification of some of the RPG elements. Because before, I mean, you really had to specialize, but now you feel more of like a general character. Like, you can just swing a two-handed sword, but you can still shoot like fireballs, like, You know, if you could just randomly switch and say, okay, let's do destruction magic. And the magic system is probably the worst. I can say the worst than it's ever been. Because before were able to craft spells, that's completely gone. So from an RPG standpoint, there's a lot that this game doesn't do very well from an RPG standpoint. However, there are some new things added in now that your character is Dragonborn, so they get all these shouts, all these cool skills. That's fun, going ethereal and all that stuff. That stuff to me is very enjoyable, and one things I like about the game. There's also the whole hand mechanic where it's like, okay, you assign weapons and stuff to each hand. In terms of, okay, your spell's assigned to a hand or whatnot, so it's like you can have a sword in one hand and electricity in the other. And for some reason I just thought that was like the coolest thing ever. Now there are some issues with Skyrim that I do have, as I've been mentioning, but you know, when it comes to going back to any of these games, this one is the one I can easily go back to, you know, pick up and play and go from there. The intro is always like rough to go through compared to Morrowind, where it's like, you know, boom boom boom. But with Skyrim, I can just get into it and, you know, pick up and play compared to the prior games. And honestly, I just find it to be a lot more enjoyable, especially when you bring in the mods. Again, I'm not gonna count mods here or anything, but you know, there was DLC, obviously expansion packs for prior games too, but there were some really good DLCs, and one of my favorites was actually being able to build the house. But like I said, all of these Elder Scrolls games have shown their age at some point, and I think a lot of that has to do with the engine that's being made. You know, a lot of legacy code, and I'm, you know, call me crazy, but I think it's the same engine since like Morrowind that's being used for like up to Fallout 4, and even Fallout 76. I'm almost certain. I think even there's still some Daggerfall code in there somehow. So I think it's just a really old engine and needs to just go. But the creation engine, I think it's called. But I will say that Skyrim is one of the better iterations of that engine. The combat is, you know, once again, like I said, with the whole spell system, the hand system. So that's been improved. There's a lot of really cool stuff you can find loot-wise. The scaling is far better in this game. There's still some BS scaling, but it's far better. You can go buy houses. There's a ton you can do in Skyrim, and you know, like I said, I can still pick up and play. Like I like going through the dungeons, figuring out the puzzles. I have put a lot of time into Skyrim, like hundreds of hours. I'd say that's probably, out of all the Elder Scrolls games, probably the one I've played the most. But I can see, again, I can see the sentiment that people do have and why they say it's kind of overrated. I get it. I really do, because I was there. But I will say that out of all these games, I have to put it at S tier. And I know some people may not like that. And I get, like I said, I get it. Everything is subjective. This list is completely subjective. It's all opinions at the end of the day. You know, it's not meant to, this isn't like a Bible or anything like that. This isn't, you know, oh, there's, you know, nothing, this is how it is and blah, blah, blah. Because if you ask me in a couple years, I may switch this around. Who the hell knows? But to me, I've always found Skyrim to be the one I've had the most fun with. I've put the most amount of time into. I've just overall enjoyed the most creating the characters. Like I said, there's some issues I do have when it comes to the overall, yeah, some of the simplifications of the RPG elements, but I think a lot was able to be improved. You know, you can find a ton of different companions. You can get you can even adopt kids. You know, I got a family, I got a house with all these weapons and unique equipment that I've gathered, and it just looks fantastic. Like if I show you my house, it look fantastic in this game. So I've had a ton of fun with this game. I continue to go back to it to have fun. So yeah, that's why to me Skyrim is S tier. Now if you asked me this a couple years ago, I probably would disagree and probably put Morrowind at S tier, and probably Oblivion would be lower. But that's the thing about Elder Scrolls to me. I feel like you can always go back to them and probably pick out something that you didn't get before, and that's really just shows you the overall freedom that these games give to the player, which is always appreciated. So I think I'm just going to end it right there. I mean, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm not sure if there'll be more tier lists in the future, but definitely if you have any recommendations for any tier lists or games you'd like me to look at, let me know. If you want me to take a deeper dive into any of these games, once again, let me know. As always, thank you for watching, and this is Powerhouse signing off.